Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're cracking open a 400-year-old cold case, the lost colony of Roanoke. We're dropping the ghost stories, the myths, and the legends, and we're just gonna forensically analyze the actual, physical evidence left behind. Let's get right into it.
So imagine you're stepping right into a crime scene with me. It's mid-August, 1590. Governor John White finally makes it back to the Roanoke settlement or the Outer Banks of what is today North Carolina. He's expecting to be greeted by the 115 men, women, and children he left behind, including, his own newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare. But instead, nothing. How do 115 people just vanish without a single trace? He finds the settlement completely abandoned. No obvious signs of what went down, just this profound, chilling silence. And one very famous word left as a clue. But to really grasp this scene, we gotta rewind and look at why he left in the first place. Back in late summer 1587, the colony was running desperately low on food and supplies. They essentially begged Governor White to sail back to England to get help. He was pretty hesitant to leave his family, but he agreed. But here's the catch. When he gets to England, he walks right into a nation at war. The Spanish Armada is threatening a massive invasion, and Queen Elizabeth locks down the ports. No ships can leave, so White is trapped by this geopolitical conflict for 3 long years. He couldn't secure passage back until 1590, and by the time he finally returned, well, the damage was already done.
Now, when you hear the phrase lost colony, your mind probably jumps straight to a violent massacre, right? But the physical evidence tells a completely different story. White found overgrown grass and weeds all over the place, which tells us the site had been empty for a good while. He found his own chests looted, and heavy stuff like massive iron bars and cannons just left behind because they were way too heavy to carry. But crucially, there were absolutely 0 human remains. No unburied bodies, no signs of a struggle or a battle. So this wasn't some sudden violent attack. This looks exactly like a meticulously packed up, deliberate, and highly strategic relocation. And that brings us right to Exhibit A in our cold case. As White and his crew are searching this overgrown, abandoned settlement, they spot a tree with the letters CRO carved into the bark. Then, a little further in, right at the colony's entrance, they find a wooden palisade post, basically part of a defensive wall, with the full word CROATOAN carved into it in big capital letters. These carvings are literally the only written messages left behind by the colonists. Now, pop culture loves to treat these words like some spooky, mystical riddle, but for the colonists, and for Governor White, they had a very specific, practical meaning. You see, context is everything here. Before White left for England in 1587, he and the colonists actually established a strict emergency protocol. They agreed that if they had to leave the settlement before he got back, they'd carve the name of their new destination into the trees or posts so he could find them. But, and this is the absolute most critical detail, if they were forced to leave in distress, like if they were under attack or in immediate danger, they were supposed to carve a Maltese cross right above the destination name. So White frantically searches that palisade post, and guess what? There was no cross. The absence of that little cross instantly flips the entire narrative on its head. In White's own accounts, he basically says, hey, since there was no cross found, I was certain the colonists had safely moved to CROATOAN Island. He wasn't terrified at all. He was actually relieved. CROATOAN was a barrier island just to the south, and it was home to Manteo, a Native American leader who was a very strong ally of the English. So to White, the physical evidence was crystal clear. His people had safely and willingly relocated to live with their friends. But as we dig a little deeper into White's own journals, a massive contradiction pops up. Right there in his writings, White casually drops this huge clue. He mentions that before he left in 1587, the colonists were already planning to move 50 miles into the mainland. And it makes sense. Roanoke Island was a terrible spot, shallow waters, awful soil, sitting ducks for enemies. But here's the big problem. CROATOAN is an island, about 50 miles south. It is definitely not the mainland. If the grand plan was to move 50 miles inland, why on earth did the carving point to an island in the complete opposite direction? For centuries, that single detail just completely stumped historians.
Exhibit B, the White Map and the Secret of Site X.
Okay, let's jump forward from 1590 to modern archaeology in 2011. Researchers from the First Colony Foundation were examining a centuries-old physical map of the coast, actually drawn and painted by Governor John White himself. Step 1, they take a really close look at the original map. Step 2, they zero in on these tiny paper patches. Now, in the 16th century, you'd normally just use these patches for minor spelling corrections, kind of like a 16th century whiteout.
But step 3 changes the whole game. When researchers carefully looked beneath the top patch on one specific area, they didn't find a typo. They found a deliberate, hidden symbol painted in invisible ink. Underneath that little paper patch was a 4-pointed star surrounded by concentric squares. In 16th century cartography, that is the exact textbook representation of a fort. And the wild part? The paint matched the rest of the map. That means John White drew this fort himself, painted over it with a secondary invisible ink symbol, and then physically glued a patch of paper right over the top to hide it from the naked eye. This was no mistake. This was a deliberate cover-up. And just look at where this hidden fort is actually located on the map. Researchers started calling it Site X. It's sitting firmly on the mainland, exactly 50 miles west of the original Roanoke settlement. Boom! Suddenly, that confusing throwaway sentence in White's journal makes total sense. The prearranged plan to move 50 miles inland wasn't some myth. White had literally mapped out the intended mainland destination, and then he actively concealed it. This completely breaks the cold case wide open. But of course, it leaves us asking one really obvious question. Why in the world would a governor hide the location of his own people? Think about it. If you're trying to rescue your daughter and your colony, why make a map that literally covers up exactly where they're going? It sounds like some bizarre conspiracy theory, but when you look at the physical evidence and the reality of the era, the answer is totally grounded in 16th century geopolitics.
Okay, let's talk about the Spanish threat. Spain claimed this entire region, and they were actively, aggressively hunting down English settlements to wipe them off the map. In fact, we know for sure that in 1608, a Spanish ambassador secretly copied a map made by John Smith and smuggled it straight to the King of Spain. English maps were incredibly highly prized intelligence. White knew that if his map fell into the hands of Spanish spies, he'd be handing them a literal treasure map to go murder his family. So covering Site X with a patch wasn't a conspiracy at all. It was just a brilliant piece of 16th century operational security. So, armed with this newly discovered map, modern archaeologists just started digging, and when we compare the physical artifacts across all 3 key locations, a really clear pattern emerges. At the original Roanoke site, we find 16th century English pottery and metals, but again, no bodies. Down south at Hatteras, which was CROATOAN Island, archaeologists found this fascinating mix of Native American and European artifacts, including a rapier sword hilt. And over at the newly discovered Site X on the mainland, they've also found intriguing fragments of English pottery and metal. Now, we might not have that definitive smoking gun proof that the entire colony lived at Site X just yet, but the tangible, physical evidence undeniably points to an English presence at both of these locations. But what was the catalyst, right? Why did they leave the original island in the first place? Well, tree ring data actually gives us incredible physical evidence here. Between 1587 and 1590, the exact 3 years White was delayed in England, this specific region experienced its most severe drought in 800 years. 800 years! That meant dwindling food supplies, extreme scarcity of fresh water, and totally failing crops. The colonists literally could not survive on Roanoke Island. They didn't just decide to pack up for a change of scenery, they absolutely had to move or they were going to starve to death.
And that brings us to what I think is the most logical forensic conclusion, tying all this evidence together: the split colony theory. It perfectly reconciles that carving on the post with the hidden patch on the map. Forced by this massive drought, the 115 colonists probably realized that a single area couldn't support all of them. So Group A moved south to Croatoan Island to live with their native allies and wait for White, leaving that reassuring carving behind. Meanwhile, Group B executed the original master plan, moving 50 miles west to Site X on the mainland to build a more permanent, hidden settlement.
So what ultimately happened to them? Let's fast forward to 1701, over a century later. An English explorer named John Lawson made contact with the Hatteras tribe, who were living on the exact same lands as the Croatoan. And Lawson wrote down this incredibly fascinating detail. The tribe told him that some of their ancestors were white, could read from books, and had gray eyes. To Lawson, this wasn't just some local ghost story. It was living, breathing evidence that the English colonists hadn't just perished in the wilderness, they had simply integrated.
And we have to talk about one final, totally bizarre piece of physical evidence: the Dare stones. Back in the 1930s, a bunch of inscribed stones popped up, supposedly carved by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. Now, almost all of them were later proven to be complete fakes, but that very first stone, it's still fiercely debated today. And here is the absolute wildest part. That first stone was allegedly discovered just a few miles north of Site X. Think about that. If it was just a forgery from the 1930s, how on earth did the forger know to plant it right next to a hidden fort that wouldn't even be discovered on a map until 2011? It's an anomaly that literally keeps archaeologists up at night.
So what should you really take away from all this? When we strip away all the spooky myths and just look at the overgrown ruins, the carefully packed up camp, the lack of distress signals, the hidden map patches, and those accounts of gray-eyed tribesmen, a much clearer picture emerges. Is the true legacy of Roanoke really a story of people just vanishing into thin air? Or is it actually a story of survival, of adaptation, and of blending seamlessly into the Native American populations that stepped up and saved them? The physical evidence strongly suggests they were never really lost at all. They just became someone else. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.